Well, here we are again with British Literature 2, and we're a little bit over 2/3 of the way through the course. So we're moving right along, and I hope that everybody is keeping up as well as possible, and that you're getting those journals in. Some people are a little slow in getting the journals in. And as I said at the very beginning, if you get a little bit behind, and that can happen to people, sometimes, with job or family issues or maybe even illness, unfortunately, from time to time. But if you get behind, just get caught up. Get those in, because remember, that is a significant part of your grade. That's 10% of the grade, the final grade. And that means that could be the difference between a whole letter in a grade, between an A and a B or a B and a C and so forth. So anyway, just a word to the wise. Well, this evening, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about Conrad in particular and focusing on the Heart of Darkness. But this is also our first discussion, our first opportunity to discuss modernism as a literary and cultural movement that really begins, in some ways it has its roots going back into the 19th century, but it really gets going right before, in the decade right before World War I, and then, of course, picks up speed enormously after World War I. So we're going to talk a little bit about modernism, because in Heart of Darkness we're going to see one of the early experiments in modernism as a literary experiment. And if we can go to the tablet, please. Okay, let me just put up here modernism. And notice that I'm not simply calling this the modern, but modernism in order to designate this as a kind of movement, which actually became a kind of cult, especially in the early part of the 20th century. And modernism, of course, in many ways is still flourishing, even though in certain respects it now has been superseded by what we have come to call postmodernism, which is something we may be able to talk a little bit about at the very end of the course. But let's go back to the tablet for a moment, because I want to just jot down here a few notes on modernism. First of all, modernism exists in a certain tension with the past, even sometimes a kind of rebelliousness against the past and against the literary and artistic and cultural and perhaps even other traditions as well. But a certain tension at the very least with the past and with tradition. A very, very strong value being placed on the new. I'm going to elaborate on these points in just a second here. A very high value being placed on the newness of the new, and that's something that we may sort of take for granted, and it may seem obvious, but I think that I'll make the point clearer as we go along. A value of the newness of the new, even at the expense of what is perceived to be the oldness of the old. And then this leads to a kind of experimentalism in all of the arts, not only in literature. And notice once again, I've put the ism on the end of this to indicate that it's a movement. And we often speak of various works of art as being experimental works of art. For example, we say that often of films. This is an experimental film. And in terms of modernism, that is to place a high artistic value on the work. Okay, this experimentalism is in both content and in form, and both of those are going to be pretty obvious as we go along. Okay, so modernism exists in a certain kind of tension with the past, first of all. We, in centuries past, and I'm talking about going all the way back to the ancients, have generally given special pride of place to the ancients. Even the ancients did, to the people who were ancients to the ancients. So that Homer certainly is constantly gesturing toward the tradition, the great past of his time. So also is Hesiod. So also is Pindar, to take three of the greatest of the literary figures of the ancient Greek world. This is something that, of course, continues on with the Romans. It continues through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance. That's what the Renaissance claimed to be all about, was going back to the traditions of antiquity, and once again making them live, making them new in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, in the early modern period of early modern Europe. That's the whole point of neo-classicism in the 17th and 18th century, a kind of revival of classicism in the arts, including literature. And even among the Romantics, who are moving in the direction of modernism, even among the Romantics, though, there is a certain deferring not only to the past of classical antiquity, but in particular the revival of an interest in and a valuing of the Middle Ages. And we've talked about that here before. We talked about that, for example, in connection with John Ruskin and how he goes back and revalues the Gothic, not only in art and architecture, but also in terms of the kind of culture that produced the Gothic cathedrals in the first place. So once again, there's a going back to at least a part of the tradition and discovering a whole new set of values in that part of the tradition. So also with many of the Victorians. We have the Pre-Raphaelites, who are drawing inspiration, they claim, from those painters in particular who preceded Raphael, the great Italian painter Raphael. Once again, drawing inspiration from and therefore honoring an important part of the cultural and artistic tradition. So also with the interest in things medieval and medievalism that swept through Europe in the latter part of the 19th century, in which there was this effort to try to recover what were thought to be the origins of the original spirit of the people, so that among, say, the Germanic peoples, there was a tremendous interest in things like Beowulf, because while Beowulf is in Old English at the time that it was Old English, was a Germanic tongue. And so Beowulf is the earliest long, epic, heroic work celebrating the values of that early Germanic culture that has survived to us from any of the Germanic languages. A little bit later on, of course, we have the Nibelungenlied, Das Nibelungenlied, which also is a long Middle High German poem, and it's heroic, it is epic in many respects, and that became the inspiration for, among other things, Wagner's great operas. So we have a lot of returning to the past and of deference to the past. That doesn't mean that people weren't taking from the past and making it into something new, but nevertheless there wasn't really a rebelling against the past on the basis of the pastness of the past. But by the end of the 19th century, and certainly the beginning of the 20th century, there was an increasing mood that in the kind of progress that civilization was thought to have made over the last century or so, in science, in mathematics, in all kinds of new political institutions, new social arrangements and structures, that it appeared at any rate to many people that they had not only superseded the past, but they were very much aware of what they believed to be the pastness of the past, and wanting not only to create something that was new, in which newness by itself would be given a positive value, but frequently the newness of the new derived from its rebellion against the past, against certain traditional forms, against certain traditional attitudes and values. And we find that in all of the arts, not simply in literature, though obviously as students of literature here in this course, we'll be talking primarily about literature. But let me give you some illustrations from some of the other arts as well. For example, there was the invention of photography in the first third, the end of the first third of the 19th century, and then of course it was progressively developed as an art during the 19th century, and people were fascinated with photography and what they could do with photography. And this was not simply in producing realistic pictures, though certainly you could do that, but also with the art of photography and how the photographer could not only use her or his eye in a very creative way in the selection, the framing, the treatment of particular subjects, but also how the technology itself could be used in order to create effects that really went beyond what one would find in nature. And one could create whole new kinds of images with the magic of photography and the art of photography. Or think of what was happening in painting. Painting existed now in the middle to latter part of the 19th century in a state of tension with photography. I mean, after all, if you were going to paint earlier on realistic portraits, let's say, of wealthy patrons, you know, one might try to achieve a certain kind of realism or even naturalism in that portrayal. But notice with the advent of photography, photography at least appeared to be capable of an even greater realism or naturalism than painting had ever achieved, and therefore there were all sorts of people in the arts who were wondering if painting either was going to die out or did it have to explore a whole new terrain for itself. Well, of course, that meant experimenting with new forms, right? Which is where we come into the whole issue of experimentalism. And so in painting, you have people like the Impressionists and then the Post-Impressionists, and then on into the 20th century with people experimenting with different forms of expressionism, especially abstract expressionism, and so forth. But let's go back to the Impressionists first. Notice what people were experimenting with in the early Impressionist paintings was how light and form could be reperceived, not just reconceived as with the creative brain or imagination, but how could light and form and visual images be reperceived? And how could you create paintings in which you would have light come alive. Light come alive, in a sense. And that is not something which is by itself totally new. I mean, if you look at some of the paintings of Rembrandt, for example, Rembrandt is a great master at working with chiaroscuro, what art historians call chiaroscuro, which is an Italian word meaning light and dark, and especially the different uses of darkness in relationship to the different uses of light. And in the 19th century, however, there was an effort to try to bring a new kind of energy and vitality to light itself, so that, for example, when you look at many of the paintings, the early Impressionist paintings, or some of the later ones for that matter, what you do is you see not only images, but light itself in a different way. I'm thinking of a particular painting right now in which, from the perspective of the viewer, what you're doing is you're looking into the painting, which is of a famous garden in Paris. And the land is here, and then there's a body of water, and then there's land again. And there are people walking around in the park, and there are children playing. And it's apparently on a very hot summer day. And everybody, certainly in this part of the world, knows what it's like to be out on a very hot summer day, and you look out not only over land, but particularly if you're looking over water, and what happens is that the air seems to be shimmering. In other words, the light actually is shimmering, right? And, I mean, everybody's seen this sort of thing. Okay, so how do you reproduce that in a painting? Well, there are certain kinds of techniques that the painters were experimenting with in order to bring a certain kind of living, moving quality, energizing quality to light itself, which, of course, altered form and how we perceived form in these paintings, so that there was a whole reconstruction, as it were, of how we perceive when we not only look at things in nature, but how do we perceive when we look at these scenes in paintings. Well, this is revolutionary. Nobody had really succeeded in doing some of the things that the Impressionists did before the Impressionists. For example, the shadows of clouds or other objects in the water. And what happens when we're not looking directly at the clouds, but we're looking at the reflection of clouds in water, and the water itself is moving to some extent? I mean, it obviously has to be still enough in order for us to be able to make out the images of the reflected clouds. But just as clouds are moving, so also is the water, at least to some extent, moving. There's no such thing as totally still water. And so how do you create that kind of sense? Well, experimentalism extended into the other arts as well. You think of music, and how music at the beginning of the 20th century was being transformed by people like Stravinsky and others, people who were experimenting with new tonal patterns in music. Dance. Think of, the Rites of Spring. Diaghilev with the Ballet Russe in Paris is choreographing ballet for Nureyev, which is going to be something totally new. And this choreography is done to the music of Stravinsky's Rites of Spring. Well, people were just absolutely shocked when they saw what happened, because not only was the experiment with form, both the form of the music and the form of the ballet, totally new, totally something that they were completely unprepared for as an audience for traditional music and traditional ballet as it had existed in the 19th century and up into the early 20th century, but also the explicit sexuality with which the dance was done. And of course, with the rhythms of the music, not only accompanying but reinforcing that kind of sexuality and sensuality. And there were riots in the streets, just as there had been riots in the streets earlier in Paris when the first Impressionist exhibit was put on. People got really, really, really disturbed by these things. You know, it was upsetting because the world seemed to be stable, and while it might be that there were social problems or political problems or economic problems, at least there seemed to be a kind of solidity and stability to the physical world that should not be tampered with, and also with the moral world, so that we would know what was right, what was wrong, what was moral, what was immoral, and celebrations of sexuality in some kind of very public way like this on a stage before hundreds, potentially even thousands of people, was scandalous. So that we have an experimentalism here, not only with form, but also then with content. And so we have as well in painting, in sculpture, in literature, an increasing tendency to experiment. Well, I guess we are being warned right now that we have some kind of a fire alarm going on, so I guess we're going to have to take a little break, and we'll come back to this in. Okay. Well, here we are back again. We had an unexpected break, intermission, as you saw with the notice that was on the screen there. We had some excitement here. You probably heard right before the information sign went up, or intermission sign went up, that we had a fire alarm go off, and so we all had to clear out of the building. But apparently all is well. We have an all clear now, and so we can just continue right on in our discussion of modernism, and then moving into the direct and specific discussion of Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So where we were was, I was giving you some illustrations of some of the experiments that were taking place in the different arts, and we had been talking about music and ballet, but this is also true certainly of film. We have the advent of cinema, which was being developed, and at least the technology was being developed in the latter part of the 19th century, but the very beginning of the 20th century, you begin actually to see some places in large cities where you could have a kind of Nickelodeon arrangement. You could put a coin into this apparatus, and then you could watch moving pictures through a kind of tube. But eventually, this was perfected so that you could actually project motion pictures onto screens for audiences, excuse me, for audiences in theaters. And so we have some of the very great early films of D.W. Griffith, but then others along the way. And very quickly, people see the opportunities for experimenting not only with form, but also with content. So that, for example, you could have movies like one of D.W. Griffith's films, Birth of a Nation, which unfortunately in terms of its content is blatantly and extremely racist. But on the other hand, in terms of form, some of the most dazzling experiments that have ever been done with film were done by him and also by the cinematographer Billy Bitzer, who was an absolute genius in figuring out how to use the new technology in order to create all kinds of effects that had never been produced in any art before this. So there were also experiments with content in the sense that you could have films that would deal with acts of violence. You could have forms of sexuality that had never been presented in any earlier form of art. I'm thinking, for example, of one famous film in which there is an actress who is out in a wooded area, and she runs nude, completely nude, around a little lake, and then swims and so forth. Well, you know, this sort of, it's not that you didn't have nudes in painting before or in sculpture before, it's just that you never had anything that approximated real life in this way before. So that's the kind of thing that I'm getting at in terms of experimentation. And, you know, we think in our time that television and movie producers have really pushed things very, very far in terms of the explicitness with which sex and scenes of sexual behavior have been treated. But that was also true in the early days of movies, to the point that there were some very conservative reactions. And the Hayes Act, for example, in the early 1930s, was an effort to impose, not just an effort, it was an imposition of a kind of censorship on film so that certain kinds of things could no longer be represented. For example, you couldn't have even a married couple sharing the same bed, so you would have in those films, and those of you who have seen films from the 1930s and 40s and 50s know exactly what I'm talking about, where you would have even a married couple always represented as being in separate beds in their own bedroom. So, and of course there was never any kind of nudity or much more than just a kind of veiled suggestion of something sexual. And I'm not trying to suggest that sex is alone the touchstone here, but it becomes one of the interesting kinds of cases, and also in literature, so that you have writers like James Joyce and D.H. Lawrence who are experimenting with the treatment of themes, even quite explicit sexual themes in quite explicit ways that simply had not been done in what we would consider to be literature to be taken seriously as art. I'm not talking about pornography now. I'm talking about literature that sought to be taken seriously as art. So there are lots of kinds of experiments going on in the various arts. And one of the things we're going to see in The Heart of Darkness is, first of all, the experiment with content in the sense that Conrad is going to deal with colonialism and the forms of exploitation that take place in colonialism in a way that people simply had not done before him in literary works that were intended for mass audiences and laid claim to be taken seriously as works of art. Then, in addition to that, there is this whole theme of racism and of racial exploitation. And it's not that people had never talked about racism or never talked about racial exploitation, but we're going to see how he deals with that and how critical he is of the kind of civilization that can exploit other human beings in the horrible and cruel ways that people in Africa were being exploited by white Europeans at the time. I'm not saying that this is the only time in history, but certainly he's dealing with this in terms of the latter part of the 19th century. Also, the experiments with form that we're going to be looking at in just a few minutes here. The way in which we have the narrative constructed so that we have some kind of authorial narrator or authorial voice who is setting up the scene and who comes in from time to time, but then the telling of the main narrative of The Heart of Darkness really is turned over to a man named Marlowe, who is a boatman. He's the master of a boat, which, by the way, was in Europe at the time, and particularly in England at the time, was a very special designation. You had to serve on the sea in a number of capacities for a number of years before you could qualify for a master's license, and which would be more or less what we call a captain of a ship. And in any event, this Marlowe has been a master of a boat which went up the Congo River into the heart of Africa in the 19th century. And it happens that Conrad himself had done this. Conrad, as we will be talking about in just a moment, was a person who, from a very early age, when he was a teenager really, took off and went to sea, and he went to sea in various parts of the world, and he eventually worked his way up in the companies that he worked for so that he eventually got his master's license so that he could serve as the master of a boat. And one of his experiences was taking a journey by boat up the Congo River into the heart of Africa. What at that time to Europeans had been largely unexplored. Well, we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. But the thing that I want to get at here is that we also have very interesting handling of the formal structures of the narrative and the symbolic structures of the narrative as well. So that as we're going along, we'll be looking at these kinds of shifts that are taking place, even to the point where the prose itself is absolutely remarkable. And it's hard to find an example of prose like this from the same period, or perhaps from any period in English literature. It's remarkable that Conrad was 21 years old before he even began to learn English, and he eventually became one of the greatest masters of not only the English language, but of English prose style in the whole history of English literature. So it's also interesting that when he and a good friend of his, Ford Madox Ford, went down to the seaside during a time when not very many people would be around so that they could work in relative solitude. And they were working on the manuscript of Heart of Darkness together and editing it, and they were reading it aloud to one another and making various suggestions about corrections and so forth to one another and discussing those in getting the final manuscript ready for the publisher. And at one point, Ford, who was a native Englishman, unlike Conrad, who was actually born in Poland, Ford said, "My God, do you realize what this really is? I mean, just listen to the sound of it." And Ford said, and Conrad said, "Well, no, I don't really know what you're talking about." And Ford said, "Well, let's read a few more lines." And they did. And he said, "My God, the whole thing is in blank verse." Now, blank verse is the verse of Shakespeare's plays and of many of the great plays of the English Renaissance. It is unrhymed. Shakespeare occasionally uses rhyme, but in blank verse, the verse is unrhymed, and it generally follows the pattern of iambic pentameter. Da-da, 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 da-da. Now, of course, a poet like Shakespeare, with the enormous genius that he had for poetry and poetic composition, could find all kinds of ingenious ways of varying the pattern. But nonetheless, there was a pattern there to be varied. And at one point, after Ford and Conrad realized that the work was, if not entirely, at least to a very large extent, in blank verse, they even toyed with the idea of publishing it as a poem, of Conrad publishing it as a poem. I mean, Ford was really helping him with the editing. He wasn't a co-author of the work. And so they actually toyed with that idea, but eventually decided against it, and probably for very good reason. But in any event, that does reinforce the sense that most readers have of a kind of poetic quality of so much of the work, not only in the imagery and the movement of the prose, but even of the rhythms of the prose. So that also is something that Conrad, clearly without even really thinking about it consciously, at some level of his imaginative capacity is imagining the sound as well as the imagery and movement of the prose as we experience it as readers. So, let's go back to this question of the content of the work, dealing with colonialism, colonial exploitation, which of course was rooted very deeply in Western minds in a kind of racism, which we could even extend by calling it a kind of racialism. That is to say that in the 18th century, there were actually scientists, and of course this continued into the 19th century, there were actually scientists who not only divided the human family up into what were claimed to be different racial families, but then these scientists came up with not only physical descriptions of what was distinctive about each race and how each race differed from the other races, but this was not only physical description, but was also extended to questions of mentality, of psychology, of level of intellectual development, level of moral development, so that there were some races that were considered in evolutionary terms to have evolved to a much higher level than other races. And guess who, of course, got to be at the top as the most highly evolved? naturally enough, since the scientists who were doing this were white Europeans ended up being the most highly evolved, and therefore the most civilized, and therefore morally superior, as well as superior in other ways, to the peoples of the other races. And so you had a kind of hierarchy in which you would find, from a white European point of view, the black Africans down at the bottom. Now, we've talked here before about this, and we've recognized all the way back in the poetry of William Blake his recognition that there were certain aspects of modern society that were exploitive of people who really were overpowered and didn't have the power to resist. And we saw this not only with the chimney sweeper poems, but we also saw this with the little black boy. There were, yes, people of conscience in England and elsewhere in the 19th century who were horrified by racism. On the other hand, racism was very, very, very common, and the attitude was even celebrated. I'm going to turn very briefly now to a poem by Rudyard Kipling, and if we could go to the PowerPoint, please, just for a few seconds. Thank you. Rudyard Kipling, a lot of people know about Rudyard Kipling because of stories that he did, such as Kim and so forth. Many of these have been made into movies. A very famous 19th, early 20th century short story writer and novelist. But he also wrote poetry, and one of his famous poems is entitled The White Man's Burden. The White Man's Burden. And this was a kind of tag or phrase that was picked up and then used over and over and over and over again, not only in England, but in the whole Western world. And the occasion for his writing the poem was the Spanish-American War, and you will recall, of course, from your studies of history, that in the Spanish-American War, not only did the United States invade Cuba and take over Cuba, at least for a period of time, but also invaded the Philippines and took over the Philippines for a much longer period of time as an American possession or American colony. And what Kipling is doing in this poem is he's saying, okay, Americans, look at what you are taking on. You now, like we English, are taking on the role of empire, And that role as ruler of an empire implies a certain kind of burden. So here we have the white man's burden. And I'm just going to read, the poem is not very long. I'm just going to read this to you. Very, very famous poem. Take up the white man's burden. He's addressing Americans. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed, just as England did. Send forth the best of your people to places like, the English were sending them to India, to southern parts of China, to, Pacific Islands, to Central America, to Africa, of course. Send forth the best you breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Keep that in mind when we go to the heart of darkness. Your new caught, captured, sullen peoples, they're not as happy as they ought to be about being captured by you, civilized people. They are half devil and half child, which of course then justifies the treatment of them that was carried out by many of the imperial rulers, such as the English. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times make plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. You see that what you're doing really is you're working for their profit. You're working for their gain. This was the whole justification, if you want to call it a justification, for the colonizing of the rest of the world, especially all of those parts of the world that were occupied by people of color. That you were not only assuming the white man's burden, but the white man's burden was not only to rule these peoples, but also to improve them, to raise them up to another level, so that the claim, at any rate, to justify this kind of colonial activity was that you were helping to bring people up the evolutionary scale. Not all the way up to the level of white Europeans, perhaps, but nonetheless to raise people on the evolutionary scale. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine. People are starving. Fill their stomachs. And bid the sickness cease. Bid their sickness cease. Send medical missionaries as well. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, you're doing this for others, was the claim. And of course, in Conrad, we're going to see that this is really exposed as a kind of pretense or pretext. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly, bring all your hope to naught. In other words, these people are unreliable, and you do all kinds of things for them, and they'll still, these heathens, will bring your hope to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. See, that's what you're going to get. The blame of those whose lives you make better, and the hate of those whom you guard or protect. The cry of hosts you humor, slowly toward the light. You see, you're coaxing people toward the light and toward enlightenment, and therefore civilization. But do they appreciate it? No. Why brought you us from bondage, our loved Egyptian knight? Take up, a biblical reference, of course, take up the white man's burden. You dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all you cry or whisper, by all you leave or do, the silent, sullen peoples shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the sprightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold edged with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Well, okay, this was a very, very common attitude in Europe at the time. Now, let's turn to Heart of Darkness, and we can begin to talk about this in terms of our work. So, back to the PowerPoint, please. And we see Conrad lived a quite long life, and Heart of Darkness was written right around the same time as Rudyard Kipling's poem that we just saw. And the work is, first of all, organized around a set of symbolic oppositions. all of which can be put under two columns, at least provisionally. And I've headed the two columns light and darkness because these are the images which tend to dominate and even to organize the work in many ways. And notice under these columns you have a set of oppositions in which what you have on the left-hand side is supposed to have a high positive value, and what you have on the right-hand side, in the right-hand column, is supposed to have a very low and negative value. So that Europeans see themselves as the people of light over against the people of darkness. And you'll notice, by the way, that there's even a kind of symbolic opposition between upper and lower, or higher and lower. Now, think about geography just for a moment. When we have images of planet Earth, or when we have, say, maps, right? Maps of the world, or those globes that we have in schoolrooms, some people have in their homes. What do you have? Notice that you always have the northern hemisphere up at the top. That is to say, Europe, the United States and Canada, and so forth, are up at the top. And then down at the bottom, what do you have? You have Africa, South America, and so forth. Now, notice that the very imagery with which we organize the space or depict the spatial relations in our maps and globes will itself be a way of indicating a kind of hierarchy. And that hierarchy has embedded within it certain values, positive and negative. Now, in order to understand what I'm saying, some of you will have seen these images. There are nowadays occasionally in stores maps, say, of our hemisphere, where we have North and South America, joined by Central America, of course, in which everything is reversed from the way we usually find it. So that you'll have a flat map in which South America is at the top and North America is at the bottom. South America ending at the very top of the map with the tip of South America, and below that, of course, is going to be the South Pole in Antarctica. And at the bottom of the map is North America, with, of course, Mexico, then the United States down lower, by the way, than Mexico, and then down lower still is Canada, until you finally get up to the Arctic ice cap and the North Pole, down at the very bottom. Now, notice what happens when you look at that kind of image. You realize how arbitrary it is that we not only put North America, and of course if you swing around to the other hemisphere, Europe is above Africa, right, in our normal maps. Well, what if you turn that upside down? So you have Africa on top and Europe on the bottom. See what I'm getting at? That the very structure of our maps and the way in which we display the spatial relationships between North and South imply certain kinds of hierarchies and certain kinds of values. I mean, after all, what is up and what is down? We are just a little ball whirling around in space. Who's to say what is up and what is down? It's a very, very interesting cultural construction. And who has made the cultural construction? We in the Northern Hemisphere have made that cultural construction because we're the ones who designed the maps. Okay, so we go on with our symbolic oppositions, and we have corresponding to light and enlightenment, right? We've talked about this here before. What in England and America is often referred to as the Age of Reason, in Europe, continental Europe, is usually referred to as the Enlightenment, or some term in one of the European languages for enlightenment. And this is over against the darkness from which we are supposed to have emerged, and in which the peoples of the dark continent still find themselves. And notice, then this becomes an opposition between civilization, light, enlightenment, and, on the other hand, darkness as savagery, here being the opposite of civilization. But not quite, because there was also a movement in the 18th and 19th centuries that saw in so-called savages a kind of beauty and a kind of natural energy that we in civilization had perhaps lost. So still there was a kind of ambivalence about all of that. And the ambivalence is going to be one of our key terms here, by the way. Then we come to another pair of oppositions. Liberalism in the 19th century. Liberalism as it was understood in the 19th century is very different from liberalism as we would talk about it in the 21st century. We call certain people, liberals as opposed to conservatives, and even though that kind of language is very slippery and sloppy, nonetheless we often think we know what we're talking about, whether we do or not. But 19th century liberalism was something very, very different. 19th century liberals saw themselves as civilized, enlightened people who could bring their kind of enlightenment to other peoples of other classes in their own countries through education and medical care and so forth, and perhaps even improving working conditions, at least to some extent. And also that they were going to bring the benefits of civilization to the rest of the world. And this, of course, comes back to Kipling's notion of the white man's burden. We're going to bring to these people, to the extent to which they can appreciate or even accept what we have to give, we're going to bring to them the great benefits of our science, our technology, our medicine, our culture, our morality, our religion, and so forth. I mean, think about that. The missionary activities carried out in other parts of the world, outside, Judaism never really did the same kind of thing that Christianity did in becoming very actively missionary, even in its first generation, particularly with St. Paul. And that has, for many, 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 many centuries, been one of the principal goals of Christianity, was to spread the religion throughout the entire world. Well, it's very interesting when you think about it from the other person's point of view. Here are people who come into one's land, and they not only take over your land and tell you that they're the new rulers, and you have to obey their laws and follow their rules and so forth, but you also have to follow their rules of behavior and morality and so on, and worship their God. You have to give up your own gods and worship their God. And, when you stop and think about that, that's a very peculiar kind of relationship when you view it from the other side. So that what Europeans thought of as liberalism and as a kind of liberality toward the people of the lower classes in their own countries, and also a certain kind of liberalism or liberality or generosity of spirit toward the people of the so-called dark continent, notice in this work becomes the worst kind of exploitation. The worst kind of exploitation. And then finally, we have the opposition between illusion and reality. What passes for reality turns out to be illusion. Turns out to be illusion. And, much of what I've just been talking about, you see, that there is this opposition between light and darkness, between civilization and savagery, between liberalism and these unfeeling, instinctive, almost lower than human beings. That this is all a kind of illusion that we have created in order to justify our exploitation of these people. And that's the reality. That's the reality. So, then if we can go back to the PowerPoint just for a minute. So, even while exposing the evils of racism, Marlowe does so in such a way that exposes his own racism, which is a very, very interesting problem here, that Marlowe is capable, and presumably Conrad, who created Marlowe, is capable of seeing the evils of racism in the forms that are described for us and presented to us in the work, but at the same time, Marlowe himself is racist in certain ways that he may or may not be fully aware of or fully conscious of even. Like Darwin, and as we ultimately learn, like Kurtz, he is horrified at seeing himself in the so-called savages. Remember that passage in Darwin in which I said at the time when we were looking at Darwin that we're going to come back to this? When he was in Tierra del Fuego, down at the tip, or very close to the tip, of South America, he ran into a group of these people who obviously lived there. And he talks about them as these uncivilized savages. And at the same time, with horror even, he recognizes that somehow or another he is connected to them. That somewhere in the general evolutionary scheme of things, he is connected to them. So that they have some kind of kinship with one another. And of course, that fills him with a kind of revulsion. So also with Marlowe, as we shall see, and with Kurtz. So finally, we have here a kind of ambivalence of racism struggling with itself, in the work, in ways that I hope to make clear as we go through the work. And then after we complete our analysis of the work itself, we're going to proceed to a very famous critique of Conrad's Heart of Darkness done by the very distinguished African writer Chinua Achebe, who I believe is still alive. That's why I have him down simply as born in 1930. And his work is entitled An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which was originally published in 1975. And that's a very, very interesting work. And whether you agree with Achebe either in whole or in part, it's essential that we take seriously the critique that he advances. Okay, so with all of this in mind, let's go to the work itself and spend some time actually going through passages of the work. Well, we begin. And by the way, the edition that I'm using, and I know that some of you are using different editions, and that's perfectly okay. It's just that now we run into a problem. When we're dealing with poetry, I can always point you, say, in memoriam or Tintern Abbey, to a particular line and say, okay, in line such and such, this is what's going on. And of course, whether you're using the 7th edition of the Norton Anthology or the 6th or the 5th or whatever, it doesn't make any difference because the lines of poetry are going to be numbered the same way. But with prose, that's not true. So when I refer to pages, I'm going to be referring to the page numbers in the 7th edition of the Norton Anthology. And those of you who are not working with that edition, perhaps you can look on with some of your neighbors, those of you who are here, those of you who are at home or in the library taking this as a distance education course. You could presumably find a copy of the 7th edition and or a friend who may have a copy of it so that you can check the page references. If all else fails, you could contact the assistant instructor or me, and we can probably come up with a scheme for making the adjustments in the references. Okay, so we begin The Heart of Darkness with a reference to the Nelly. The Nelly, of course, is a ship. And the ship is swinging on her anchor, and this is on the Thames. And of course, as everybody I'm sure knows, the Thames is the great river that leads from the eastern coast of England, the southeastern coast actually, of England, into London, which is not on the coast, but this makes London a coastal city in effect. So the sea reach of the Thames at the beginning of the second paragraph stretched before us like the beginning of an interminable waterway. And what they're doing is they're waiting for the tide. The tide presumably has come in, and so in a sailing vessel, they're going to wait for the tide to go out because then the tide will carry the vessel out rather than having to struggle against the tide. And then in the 4th paragraph, going down about half a dozen lines, we have the first reference to Marlowe. There are a bunch of people sitting around on the deck of this ship, one of whom is Marlowe, who sat cross-legged right aft, leaning straight back, an ascetic aspect, and with his arms dropped, the palms of hands outward, resembled an idol. And guess what kind of an idol? We're talking about the Buddha, right? So here is Marlowe, who is a world traveler, who has experienced many other cultures from his travels around the world. And here now he is proclaiming a story in a kind of Buddha-like way. Now, don't get that wrong. This is not really a Buddhist story, but he is represented here as a kind of Buddha, is a kind of wise person. But in what does his wisdom consist? Well, okay. Who are these people? Who are all these people? Over on the next page, at the end of the first long paragraph there, about the middle of the page, that's 1959. Hunters for gold or pursuers of fame, they all, these are people who have gone out around the world as conquerors and colonizers. They all had gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of the might, the power within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth? The dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empires. Well, okay, and then two paragraphs below that, the very, very short paragraph, and this also, said Marlowe suddenly, has been one of the dark places of the earth. What does that mean? This? England. England has been one of the dark places of the earth. This is our first hint of this sort of thing. Let's get a perspective on things. We Englishmen at the end of the 19th century may think of Africa or South America as dark places, or the interior of Australia for that matter, as dark places of the earth, but our England was at one time a dark place of the earth too. So, page 1960, up toward the top, 5 lines down. The yarns of seamen, this is going to be a seaman's yarn, Marlowe's, have a direct simplicity, the whole meaning of which lies within the shell of a cracked nut. It's a very ancient image for something which is a symbolic story. But Marlowe is not typical, if his propensity to spin yarns be accepted. And to him, the meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale, which brought it out only as a glow brings out a haze, in the likeness of one of these misty halos that sometimes are made visible by the spectral illumination of moonshine. And what is he thinking about? Well, he tells us in the long paragraph that begins about a third of the way down page 1960, he tells us about the Romans, who saw themselves as civilized men coming into a land of darkness in which the people were uncivilized savages, and they even called them barbarians. The word barbarian was originally coined by the Greeks, who, when they were listening to other peoples, that is to say people who were not Greek, speaking their own languages, to the Greeks, it sounded like they were simply saying bar, 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 and so the Greeks called them all simply barbarians. Well, okay. Well, this goes on, and down at the bottom of the page there, this is page 1960 still, look at about the last 7 lines or so. And Marlowe is talking about England at the time of the Romans. Land in a swamp, march through the woods, and in some inland post feel the savagery, the utter savagery, had closed round him. All that mysterious life of the wilderness that stirs in the forest, in the jungles, in the hearts of wild men. There's no initiation either into such mysteries. He has to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is also detestable. And it has a fascination, too, that goes to work on him. The fascination of the abomination, Imagine the growing regrets, the longing to escape, the powerless disgust, the surrender, the hate. And we're going to hear those words echoed in the descriptions of Kurtz later on. And, of course, of Marlowe, too, in certain ways. So at the top of 1961, we have, once again, Marlowe is speaking after a brief pause, as a kind of Buddha in line 4. And then about 6 lines down from the top of the page, this is Marlowe speaking. They were no colonists. He's talking about people who have come, from one land to another, as conquerors, colonial rulers. They were no colonists. Their administration was merely a squeeze and nothing more, I suspect. They were conquerors, and for that you want only brute force. Nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery and violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only, an idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. Now, what is that going to be? Well, let's see after our break.